The afternoon of November 3rd, 1965, was cold and overcast in Harlem, with temperatures in the low 40s and a raw wind that made the air feel even colder. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, most people were either at work or inside their homes trying to stay warm, and the sidewalks along residential streets were relatively empty, except for a few people hurrying between buildings. Dorothy Henderson was 57 years old in November 1965 and had lived in a small row house on West 139th Street for 22 years. Dorothy had moved into the house in 1943 with her husband, William Henderson, who had worked as a postal carrier for the United States Postal Service. William and Dorothy had purchased the house with a mortgage from Harlem Savings Bank, making monthly payments of $48 over 20 years. By 1963, and the mortgage had been nearly paid off with only 18 months of payments remaining. In August 1963, William Henderson had died suddenly of a heart attack at age 56 while at work. William's death had left Dorothy devastated emotionally and in severe financial difficulty. William's postal worker pension provided Dorothy with a survivor benefit of $65 monthly, but this was barely sufficient to cover Dorothy's basic living expenses, including food, utilities, and other necessities. Dorothy had no other income because she had not worked outside the home since marrying William in 1941, and was now considered too old by most employers to be hired for the kinds of jobs available to women with limited work experience. Dorothy had continued making the $48 monthly mortgage payments for several months after William's death by using savings William had accumulated. But by early 1964, these savings were depleted. Dorothy missed the March 1964 mortgage payment, then the April payment, then May and June. Dorothy received notices from Harlem Savings Bank stating that her mortgage was in default and that she needed to bring the account current or face foreclosure. Dorothy attempted to negotiate with the bank, explaining that her husband had died and that she was living on a small pension that made it impossible to pay both the mortgage and her other living expenses. Dorothy asked whether the bank could reduce her monthly payment or defer some payments until she could find employment. The bank stated that they could not modify the mortgage terms and that Dorothy needed to either pay the full amount due or the house would be foreclosed. By November 1965, Dorothy had missed 19 monthly mortgage payments totaling $912, including late fees. On November 1st, Dorothy received a notice from Harlem Savings Bank stating that foreclosure proceedings would begin on November 15th and that Dorothy would be required to vacate the house by December 1st unless she paid the full amount owed. The notice stated that the bank would sell the house at auction to recover the outstanding mortgage balance. On the afternoon of November 3rd, Dorothy stood in the kitchen of her house, holding the foreclosure notice and understanding that she would lose the home she had lived in for 22 years, where she and William had built their life together, and where all her memories of their marriage resided. Dorothy had no family in New York who could take her in, and no resources to find other housing. Dorothy understood that losing the house likely meant becoming homeless. Dorothy put on her coat and walked to her church, St. Mark's Methodist Church on Edgecombe Avenue, to speak with the pastor about whether the church might have any resources to help her. Dorothy arrived at the church at approximately 2:30 and found the pastor, Reverend James Wilson, in his office. Dorothy explained her situation, that her husband had died 2 years ago, that she had been unable to keep up with mortgage payments on her small pension, that the bank was foreclosing, and that she would be required to leave her home within 4 weeks. Reverend Wilson listened sympathetically, but stated that the church had limited funds available for emergency assistance and could not provide the nearly $1,000 Dorothy needed to stop the foreclosure. Reverend Wilson suggested that Dorothy speak with social services agencies to see if she qualified for any government assistance programs, though Reverend Wilson acknowledged that such programs were limited and often had long waiting lists. Dorothy left the church feeling even more hopeless than before. Dorothy walked slowly home, moving carefully on the cold sidewalks and thinking about where she would go when she was forced to leave her house. Dorothy had no answers to this question. That evening, Dorothy mentioned her situation to her neighbor across the street. A woman named Eleanor Thompson, who was approximately 60 years old and who had lived on West 139th Street for 15 years. Thompson stated that she knew someone who might be able to help, that there was a man in the neighborhood named Bumpy Johnson who was known for helping people facing housing problems. Thompson explained that Johnson had helped other residents avoid eviction and that it might be worth trying to contact him about Dorothy's foreclosure. Dorothy was hesitant because she knew that Johnson was involved in illegal gambling operations. Dorothy had lived a conventional life as the wife of a postal worker and had never had any involvement with criminal activities. But Dorothy also recognized that she had no other options and that losing her home would be catastrophic. Thompson arranged for Dorothy to speak with Johnson through an intermediary. On November 5th, Dorothy received a message that Johnson would meet with her at 4 o'clock that afternoon at a location on Lenox Avenue. Dorothy went to the meeting, which took place in an office above a restaurant. Johnson was 59 years old in November 1965 and had recently returned to Harlem after serving a decade at Alcatraz for drug conspiracy. Johnson listened as Dorothy explained her situation. Dorothy's husband had died 2 years earlier. Dorothy was living on a small pension of $65 monthly. Dorothy owed the bank $912 in missed mortgage payments and late fees. The bank was foreclosing, and Dorothy would be forced to leave her home by December 1st unless she paid the full amount owed. Dorothy had no savings, and no family who could help, and no way to obtain the money needed to stop the foreclosure. Johnson asked several specific questions. How long had Dorothy lived in the house? How much was the original mortgage? How many payments remained when her husband died? What was the current outstanding balance on the mortgage? What was the value of the house? Why had the bank refused to modify the payment terms? What would happen to Dorothy if she lost the house? Dorothy answered each question. Dorothy had lived in the house for 22 years. The original mortgage had been for $4,500 over 20 years. Only 18 months of payments had remained when William died. The current outstanding balance, including missed payments and fees, was approximately $1,200. And the house was worth approximately $7,000 based on recent sales of similar properties in the neighborhood. The bank had refused to modify payment terms because their policy did not allow for such modifications. If Dorothy lost the house, she would have nowhere to live and would likely become homeless. Johnson sat quietly for approximately 2 minutes after Dorothy finished answering his questions. Johnson understood that what he was hearing represented not just Dorothy's individual problem, but a systemic issue affecting widows throughout Harlem and throughout the country. When a husband died, his widow often lost the household's primary income and faced immediate financial crisis. Existing social support systems were inadequate. Pension benefits were minimal, employment opportunities for older women were limited, and banks showed little flexibility in modifying mortgage terms for people facing hardship. Johnson recognized that simply paying Dorothy's overdue mortgage payments would solve her immediate problem, but would not address the underlying issue of how she would continue making payments going forward on her $65 monthly pension. What was needed was a solution that would provide permanent housing security rather than temporary relief. Johnson asked Dorothy one final question. If Johnson paid off her entire mortgage so that she owned the house free and clear with no further payments owed, would Dorothy be able to afford to maintain the house with her pension, covering only property taxes, utilities, and basic maintenance? Dorothy calculated quickly and stated that property taxes were approximately $200 annually. The utilities averaged about $15 monthly, and basic maintenance costs were minimal. Dorothy's pension of $65 monthly would cover these expenses with some money remaining for food and other necessities. Dorothy stated that if the mortgage were paid off completely, she could manage to stay in the house indefinitely. Johnson made a decision. Johnson stated that he would pay off Dorothy's entire mortgage, that Dorothy would own the house free and clear with no debt, and that Dorothy would never have to worry about losing her home. Johnson stated that this was not a loan, and that Dorothy would not be required to pay Johnson back. Johnson stated only that Dorothy should continue living in the house and should help other people in the neighborhood when she was able to do so. Dorothy sat in the chair feeling overwhelmed. The offer represented more than Johnson would earn in several weeks of illegal gambling operations and would solve the problem that had been destroying Dorothy's sense of security and stability for nearly 2 years. Dorothy asked why Johnson was willing to do this. Johnson stated simply that widows should not lose their homes because banks refused to show flexibility, that long-term residents of Harlem deserved to remain in their communities, and that protecting people's housing was protecting the neighborhood's social fabric. Johnson continued that beyond paying off Dorothy's mortgage, Johnson would establish a fund that would provide Dorothy with a small monthly supplement to her pension to ensure she had sufficient income for all her needs. Johnson stated that Dorothy would receive an additional $30 monthly for as long as she lived, ensuring that her total income would be $95 monthly rather than $65. This additional income would give Dorothy greater financial security and would prevent future crises. Dorothy left the meeting feeling as though a crushing weight had been lifted. The previous day, Dorothy had been facing homelessness within 4 weeks. Now, Dorothy would own her home outright and would have sufficient income to live with dignity and security. Johnson spent November 6th through November 10th implementing the arrangements he had described to Dorothy. The implementation required multiple components: paying off the mortgage, ensuring proper transfer of title to Dorothy free of all liens, establishing the monthly income supplement, and creating systematic processes to ensure the support would continue reliably. The first component was paying off the mortgage. Johnson instructed an associate to contact Harlem Savings Bank and to arrange payment of Dorothy's full outstanding mortgage balance. The bank calculated the total amount as $1,237, including all missed payments, late fees, and remaining principal. Johnson provided this amount in cash through his associate on November 8th. The bank issued a satisfaction of mortgage document indicating that the debt had been paid in full and that Dorothy Henderson owned the property at West 139th Street free and clear of all encumbrances. The second component was ensuring proper title transfer. Johnson arranged for an attorney to verify that the satisfaction of mortgage was properly recorded and that Dorothy held clear title to the property with no liens or claims against it. This verification was completed on November 10th, providing Dorothy with legal documentation that she owned her home outright. The third component was establishing the monthly income supplement. Johnson instructed a trusted associate named Marcus Foster to deliver $30 in cash to Dorothy on the first day of each month beginning December 1st. Foster was told that this arrangement would continue for as long as Dorothy lived and that Foster should ensure the payments were made reliably regardless of other circumstances. Johnson allocated funds from his gambling operations to cover these monthly payments indefinitely. The fourth component was creating systematic processes. Johnson recognized that the arrangement needed to function reliably even if Johnson himself was unavailable due to imprisonment, illness, or death. Johnson established procedures where Foster would make the monthly payments, Foster would maintain records of payments made, and if Foster became unable to perform this duty for any reason, another designated associate would assume responsibility. Johnson allocated sufficient funds to cover decades of monthly payments. These four components were completed between November 6th and November 10th. The mortgage was paid off and Dorothy received legal documentation of her ownership. The monthly supplement arrangement was established with systematic procedures to ensure reliability, and Dorothy was informed that everything was complete and that she should consider the house permanently hers with no threat of foreclosure. By November 15th, the date when foreclosure proceedings would have begun, Dorothy instead owned her home free and clear and had received her first monthly supplement payment. Dorothy continued living in the house with financial security and peace of mind that had been absent since her husband's death 2 years earlier. The resolution of Dorothy Henderson's housing crisis created effects that extended beyond one widow's situation. Word spread through St. Mark's Methodist Church and through the neighborhood that Johnson had paid off a widow's mortgage and had arranged ongoing financial support. The demonstration that Johnson would use substantial resources to protect vulnerable community members from homelessness reinforced his reputation as someone who defended Harlem residents and who understood that housing security was fundamental to community stability. The establishment of ongoing support, rather than just one-time assistance, provided a model for how to address housing insecurity systematically. Many charitable efforts provided temporary help, paying 1 month's rent or providing emergency funds, but such assistance often just delayed rather than solved underlying problems. Johnson's approach of eliminating the mortgage debt entirely and supplementing income ongoing created permanent stability rather than temporary relief. For other widows in Harlem who faced similar difficulties after their husbands' deaths, Dorothy's story demonstrated that help was available and that Johnson would intervene to prevent displacement of long-term residents. Several other widows facing foreclosure or eviction contacted Johnson's associates seeking similar assistance. While Johnson could not help everyone, his resources were substantial but not unlimited. He did intervene in several additional cases over the next few years, paying off mortgages or covering rent arrears for widows and other vulnerable residents facing displacement. The precedent that banks' inflexible foreclosure policies would be challenged created some caution among financial institutions about pursuing foreclosures against widows and other sympathetic cases in Harlem. Several banks began showing slightly more flexibility in modifying payment terms or extending timelines when borrowers faced hardship due to death of a spouse, understanding that aggressive foreclosure actions might trigger intervention from Johnson or other community figures. For the social fabric of West 139th Street and the surrounding neighborhood, Dorothy's continued residence maintained community continuity. Dorothy had lived on the street for 22 years and was known to dozens of neighbors and families. Her presence provided stability and institutional memory that would have been lost if she had been displaced. The fact that Dorothy remained in her home signaled to other long-term residents that the community would protect them from displacement. The case illustrated principles that characterized Johnson's most effective community interventions. The response to Dorothy's crisis had been comprehensive rather than minimal. Johnson had not simply paid the overdue mortgage payments and left Dorothy to struggle with ongoing payments she could not afford. Instead, Johnson had recognized that permanent housing security required eliminating the mortgage debt entirely and ensuring adequate ongoing income. This systematic thinking addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. The establishment of ongoing support mechanisms, the monthly supplement payments with procedures to ensure continuity, demonstrated understanding that protecting vulnerable people required sustained commitment rather than one-time gestures. The allocation of resources to fund decades of monthly payments represented significant long-term investment in one person's security and dignity. The quiet nature of the intervention, no public announcements, no publicity, just practical arrangements that solved Dorothy's problem, reflected a preference for effective action over dramatic gestures. Dorothy received her homeownership documentation and her monthly supplement payments without any requirement that she publicly acknowledge Johnson or participate in any events celebrating his generosity. The assistance was provided because Dorothy needed it and because protecting community members' housing was important, not because Johnson sought public recognition. The story of how Dorothy Henderson had faced foreclosure and homelessness, and how Bumpy Johnson had paid off her mortgage and provided lifelong support, became one of many narratives that circulated in Harlem about Johnson's protection of vulnerable community members. The story emphasized the systematic nature of the response, paying the full mortgage, ensuring clear title, establishing monthly supplements, creating procedures for continuity, and the lifelong security that resulted. Whether remembered precisely or embellished through retelling, the narrative captured essential truths about how Johnson understood community protection and how he used resources. Widows deserved security after their husbands' deaths. Long-term residents should not be displaced because of financial institutions' inflexible policies. Comprehensive solutions were better than temporary assistance. Systematic, ongoing support was more effective than one-time help. Real victories were measured not by dramatic moments, but by whether vulnerable people remained secure in their homes with dignity intact. The legacy extended beyond Dorothy's individual case. The precedent that Johnson would protect widows from foreclosure influenced how other vulnerable residents approached housing crises. They understood that help was available and that the community would not allow long-term residents to become homeless. The demonstration that comprehensive support could provide permanent stability rather than temporary relief influenced how some charitable organizations thought about assistance programs. The protection of Dorothy's continued residents maintained neighborhood stability and community continuity. These outcomes required no celebration or exaggeration to demonstrate their value. A widow retained her home. Housing security was provided permanently rather than temporarily. Financial stability was ensured through ongoing support. Community continuity was maintained. A precedent was established. The legacy endured. Dorothy Henderson continued living in her house on West 139th Street for the next 18 years until her death in 1983 at age 75. Dorothy received the $30 monthly supplement reliably for 18 years, as Johnson had promised, continuing even after Johnson's death in 1968, because the systematic procedures Johnson had established ensured the payments continued. Dorothy calculated that over 18 years she received approximately $6,480 in supplemental income in addition to the $1,237 Johnson had paid to eliminate her mortgage debt, a total investment of approximately $7,117 in one widow's security and dignity. When Dorothy died in 1983, she left the house to her niece, who had been her closest living relative. The niece sold the house for $12,000, considerably more than the $7,000 it had been worth in 1965. Dorothy's niece learned from neighbors about how Johnson had saved Dorothy from foreclosure and had provided ongoing support. The niece understood that her aunt's final 18 years had been lived with security and dignity because of Johnson's intervention. Marcus Foster, the associate Johnson had assigned to deliver monthly supplements to Dorothy, continued making these payments reliably from 1965 until Dorothy's death in 1983. Foster also made similar monthly payments to 3 other widows whose mortgages Johnson had paid off in subsequent years. Foster maintained careful records of all payments and ensured that the arrangements Johnson had established continued functioning even after Johnson's death. Foster died in 1991, having faithfully executed Johnson's instructions to protect vulnerable community members for more than 25 years. The house on West 139th Street, where Dorothy Henderson lived from 1943 to 1983, remained standing and occupied through subsequent decades, continuing to provide housing to families and maintaining the residential character of the block. The continuity of the neighborhood, with houses remaining occupied by long-term residents rather than being lost to foreclosure and subsequent neglect or conversion, contributed to West 139th Street's relative stability during periods when other Harlem blocks experienced significant deterioration. The quiet power of the intervention, paying off a mortgage, establishing ongoing support, creating systematic procedures, ensuring 18 years of security and dignity, stood in contrast to dramatic narratives that often characterized stories about powerful figures. There was no confrontation with the bank. There was no public celebration of Johnson's generosity. There was only systematic action that solved a problem, created permanent security, and maintained community stability. This was the reality of how power operated when wielded by people who understood that protecting vulnerable community members required comprehensive solutions rather than temporary assistance, that housing security was fundamental to community stability, that systematic ongoing support was more effective than one-time help, that quiet effective action was better than dramatic gestures, and that real victories were measured not by dramatic moments, but by whether people remained secure in their homes, whether dignity was maintained, and whether community continuity was preserved through protecting long-term residents from displacement.